Welcome to our newscasting project. We are Group 14, and we are focusing on the women's rights movement. I'm Campbell.
I'm Morgan.
I'm Hannah.
I'm Mallory.
I'm Kylie.
So the women's rights movement is significant because it marks a time in American history where women joined together in protesting their mistreatment in society and began fighting for equal rights. I will be discussing some of the history of the movement before we get into more of the sociological imagination aspects of the movement. The women's rights movement, as we know it, began in 1873 after Congress passed the Comstock Acts, which prevented women from receiving information about contraceptives. This sparked feminist advocate Margaret Sanger to publish multiple essays such as Woman Rebel and Family Limitation, as well as found the first birth control clinic in the country. It should be noted, however, that Margaret Sanger was a steadfast believer in eugenics, and this does not completely negate her work in the women's rights movement. The suffragette movement, which lasted from 1876 to 1922, can be thought of as a sub-movement to the women's rights movement at large. This fight for voting rights was influenced heavily by similar ones happening in Europe contemporaneously. It should be noted, however, that this and similar movements of the time were run and centered around almost exclusively white women. Finally, the Equal Rights Amendment marks a similarly important instance in the women's rights movement. The ERA stated that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. It was passed by Congress in 1972, but failed to be ratified by enough states to enter the Constitution. Author, professor, and activist Allison Cornish Thorne described the fight for the passing of the ERA in states like Utah, where grassroots organizations such as the League of Women Voters, General Education of Women's Clubs, among others, protested together in support of the ERA. This brief history of the women's rights movement brings us to today. With Roe v. Wade overturned in 2022, many states, including Ohio, passing excessive abortion bans, and DEI under attack by the federal government. The current state of women's rights proves that there is still work to be done, even after over 100 years of fighting.
A sociologist should study the women's rights movement to understand the many historical factors that influence gender inequality and how it has shaped our world. When sociologists study this movement, they analyze the many factors that shape this movement and how individual actions contribute to social change and how the movement has evolved over time. It is important for us to view the women's rights movement through a sociological imagination in order for us to fully understand the different ways in which this movement has changed and evolved over time. There are many aspects of sociology that contribute to this movement, and we must acknowledge each one of them, and these include politics, family, life, community. Viewing this through a sociological imagination lens allows us to understand how these individual experiences and larger forces shape historical events. When we use this perspective to analyze the women's rights movement, it helps us understand the connection between the personal struggles and how they relate to a broader context of societal structures and cultural norms. Personal struggles and societal patterns are always intertwined. Individual action often leads to collective action, and that influences the certain movement. For example, the unequal pay of women is of course not a personal failure. It is merely a reflection of systemic gender discrimination built into labor laws and societal norms that view women as less than. This movement is extremely necessary because through it, our voices as women are amplified and we become closer to reaching gender equality. It is also necessary because, as a society and recent events, we are going backwards. This movement continues to be in action today and works towards reshaping power structures and fighting systemic gender inequality. According to an article published by Harvard International Review, this growing presence of women in positions of power reflects their determination to shape the future and amplify their voices in a world that, just a century ago, was dominated by men.
The women's rights movement shows us how deeply inequality truly is woven into society today, and that's exactly why we need social science to prove it. Take Kimberly Crenshaw's work on intersectionality, for example. She showed how race, class, and gender overlap to create unique forms of oppression. Without studying these complexities, we can't really understand or fix them. And it's not just about theory, data matters too. Reports like the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Report give us hard numbers on things like pay gaps and political representation. These stats are crucial for holding people accountable and tracking progress. Plus, research on cultural norms like Raywin Connell's work on masculinity helps us see how society reinforces traditional gender roles. Social science gives us the tools to diagnose problems, measures, and progress push for solutions that actually work. So where do we go from here? First, we need stronger policies, enforcing equal pay laws, and protecting reproductive rights, especially after Roe v. Wade was overturned. These should be top priorities. We also have to address intersectional inequalities like focusing on education and healthcare for women in the global south, and making sure the movement includes transgender and non-binary people. Cultural change is huge too. Media representation matters as studies show biased portrayals and how they reinforce stereotypes. So we need more diverse and accurate stories. And education reform, absolutely. Teaching kids about gender equality early on can help break down those harmful stereotypes before they take root. And let's not forget about economic empowerment. Women entrepreneurs face unique barriers, so they need more support and funding. Plus, unpaid care work like childcare and elder care must be addressed through policies like paid family leave and subsidized childcare. At the end of the day, social science helps us see the big picture and act. Change starts locally, so supporting women-owned businesses, joining community organizations, and pushing for policy changes in our community will make this better.
Understanding the women's rights movement from a perspective of a woman's right is important. It empowers women to advocate for their equality and highlights the progress made and all the work that is still needed. This awareness recognizes the various forms of discrimination women can face by fostering a supportive community that works together to overcome those challenges. It also influences policies that protect and promote women's rights, making sure women's voices are heard in decision-making progresses. It educates both men and women about the importance of gender equality, challenging stereotypes and biases. Adopting this understanding, we can better support and advocate for women's rights. The audience includes people who are passionate about learning more about women's rights and men who also need to learn more about the topic. We've got those who are super into women's rights and want to learn the latest updates and stories. Then there are guys and women who might not know much about the gender equality and need to learn more. We can help them see why it's important and how it benefits everyone. Young adults and students are key too because they often are really passionate about social issues and are eager to get involved.
So although the women's rights movement has been around for a long time, there are still aspects of it where we see minimal change. One area we especially see no recent change is in the gender pay gap, where a study by the Pew Research Center concludes that in 2022, women earn an average of 82% of what men earned. In 2002, women earned 80% as much as men, based on analysis of median hourly earnings of both full and part-time workers. This pay gap has not gotten better over time, which is unfortunate for women in the U.S. One thing that certainly could be considered a success by the women's rights movement would be equal pay on the dollar for men and women. Another feat that I think could be considered a success for women's rights movement could be better maternity leave conditions. Systematic reviews conducted by the National Partnership for Women and Families conclude that paid leave improves maternal and infant health and well-being. It also found that an increase of paid paternal and/or maternity leave decreases rates of infant mortality. Black, Latinx, and low-wage workers bear the brunt of the lack of paid leave, as they overall have the least amount of access to it. The U.S. is one of the few countries that doesn't have a national paid leave of any kind, and I think that changing that could be a very successful endeavor for the women's rights movement. So that leads us to our final question. How can we help make these changes happen? One of the most important things when it comes to topics like these is spreading information and knowledge. There are certainly many people out there who don't know about things like the gender pay gap, but would definitely care if they were informed. I'm sure many people from our imagined audience are women who are making less on the dollar than their male coworkers, and would see this as an issue as well. Another solution to issues with maternity leave in the U.S. could be Congress passing a Family and Medical Insurance Leave Act, which would guarantee access to paid leave and meet the needs of pregnant people, caregivers, and families. Paid leave must include family care and personal medical leave in order to meet the basic needs of working people, family, and the economy. Until a comprehensive federal paid leave law is passed, states and businesses should join California, Colorado, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, Rhode Island, Washington, D.C., and more, and almost 200 major companies have announced a new or expanded paid leave program. There is no one solution to these problems, but if we continue to work together to fight for what we see as right, we can hopefully see a change in the future.
I feel like a lot of men kind of don't include themselves in women's rights talks, both because, yes, a lot of the time it doesn't really affect them directly, but it affects everybody in some kinds of ways.
Exactly. I feel like when men kind of push aside that, like, oh, well, it doesn't affect my life, they don't look at that you have a sister, you have a mother. There are women in their lives that it does affect, but I think that it's just more of a selfishness and an ego type of filled thing that men do, which we're all aware of. But yeah.
And it's also like growing up, I feel like obviously these stereotypes have been ingrained in our society for like a long time, so it's still like, I don't know, it depends on like parenting also, and it's like, how are you raising these children, how are you like raising your son to treat women? It's like different all across the board.
That kind of goes back to like the stereotypes I talked about in like reforming like school systems. If it was talked of and like addressed at young ages, kids wouldn't feel the need to like.
Well, something I feel like I've noticed too is that men like to talk about women's rights when it comes to abortion, but not about like women's equal pay or, you know, anything else basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so true. They only ever really, it's more of a body problem.
Yeah.
Control. Problem, unfortunately. But yeah.
So in conclusion, we need to hone in on women's rights in society. The movement continues with everyone's collective action and knowledge, regardless of gender. We need to rethink the American dream and focus more on the equality and success of a woman. No one would be here without a woman. Thank you for tuning in our project. From Group 14, this is Kylie.
This is Hannah.
This is Mallory.
This is Campbell.
Morgan.
This is Morgan.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.